You have to look around you and see how quickly the innovation's happening. El Salvador got involved. Well, it's just one small country, and now you've got the biggest economic power in the world starting to have these conversations. That adoption cycle is real, and it's coming really fast. I don't think any of us thought that we would be in the position where the US would be talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves in 2025. That was quick. You're retiring from doing things you don't want to do anymore. You've freed yourself up, you've bought back your time, and now in your retirement, you get to figure out what it is you're actually passionate about. A lot of people actually become more successful in retirement. You're no longer tied down to a job you didn't really want to have. You're spending all your time focusing on trying to get a 5 or a 10% raise year over year on your salary. But then eventually you accumulate enough assets on your balance sheet where you go, maybe my efforts aren't best spent on 5% of my income. Maybe 5% is a much more drastic number if I find 5% more return on the value of my balance sheet. Innovation's happening at lightning speeds now. If you ignore that, you're going to fall behind. You're still very much on the front end of the adoption curve today, but nobody can promise how long that's going to last.
Before we start off with MicroStrategy talks, maybe just to get your take on what's the whole strategic Bitcoin reserve thing with Trump going to be like. What's your take on the USA and Bitcoin currently?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I think everyone was really optimistic leading into the inauguration. And then there was some of the funny business that came out with some of the meme coins that they were launching. And I think that soured quite a few people on what they were really expecting. I always try to keep my expectations pretty low, mostly because I don't think Bitcoin needs any of these things. It's a nice to have. It's not a must have. But I do think that we will see some type of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Whether I think that they really go for it in the early days, I'm not as optimistic about that. I agree with a lot of people when I think that they'll stop selling the coins that they do have, and they'll hold that as kind of an initial foundation for a strategic reserve. But from there, I think that it's going to take some time for us to, get things like the Lummis bill, to get that to pass and to do the education rounds that are going to be needed for that. But this is the first time that we've had a really favorable administration. Right? Whatever you think about the meme coins, right? They're at least participating in the broader digital asset ecosystem. So while I didn't love the move, I can at least acknowledge that it's showing their interest in participation there. And because some of their own, like that World Liberty Fi or whatever they've got, because they were buying some form of Bitcoin, I know it was wrapped Bitcoin, but the fact that they're starting to participate and align their interests with the interests of Bitcoin, I see that as a positive long term. Everyone goes through an education cycle. I always say that, people need to go to all these alternative coins before they really find out that the true value is in Bitcoin, and that's really just where you should focus. And I'm not immune to that either, right? I mean, my journey started that way too, where you're out there in the internet casino gambling with the best of them. And you got to get hurt a few times before you figure out maybe this isn't something I should participate in. If I can articulate the value proposition of one of these very clearly, maybe that's the one that's got the long-term value proposition that I should stick with. And so you do that full circle to Bitcoin. I don't think for this administration, it's going to be any different. I think that they're going to go through this education process. They're getting lobbied by all types of parties, right? Just as much as the Bitcoin industry is lobbying them, you can be sure that the Ethereum and Solana and all these guys are talking to them and donating money. And so their attention is spread. And because of that, I think it's going to take a little bit of time for them to work through their priorities and to really get the full understanding of why they should participate in the world's strongest decentralized monetary network. And to me, ultimately, it becomes a strategic imperative to the United States, right? If there's one thing that's a risk to the US dollar, it would be the rest of the world starting to participate in that decentralized network, but the US staying behind. Right? It's very easy to get comfortable when your currency is the reserve currency of the world, but you have to look around you and see how quickly the innovation's happening. And we've very quickly become a digital world. We're all connected now. And that's not going to be any different with the money, right? There shouldn't really be any friction in this day and age for me to take value and transmit it over to Japan if I wanted to instantly. I shouldn't have to ask anybody if it's my money, right? So when you see that, and now that people have started to get educated on the weaknesses of fiat currencies, And these past 5 years, when the inflation really took off, I think people really got a master's level education in what currency debasement and inflation really means for them as an individual. And all of these moves are going to start at the ground level, and that's with people. And people are what make up corporations, people are what make up governments. So when you start to get that education and you tie it into your own personal life and understand what you're losing all the time by sitting and being comfortable, you start to see the value proposition in Bitcoin rather clearly, rather quickly, when the rest of the world around you is getting more expensive instead of less expensive. So I think that education will work its way up the ranks. And I do think ultimately it'll land with the United States with a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Whether it happens right away or a little bit down the line, that's a little less clear.
That's interesting. It's also the thought just popped in my head, like what is better, a government that is cracking down on crypto and really have like the Gary Gensler aspect to it of like, let's fight against those cryptocurrencies, or a government that is embracing Bitcoin, but also all the crypto things and bringing the shitcoinery on a whole new level with the government.
It's an interesting question, right? I mean, I'm not quite sure what the right answer is. You like to see that they're at least embracing the ecosystem. You just don't want them to do it in a way that ends up hurting people, right? The people that are now participating in all of these, shit coins that are out there, it's people that are desperate a lot of the times, right? It's either degenerate gamblers, right, trying to hit that 10,000x home run, or it's people that are viewing this as their way out of their current situation. And we've become very short term in our focus in society now. And I think social media has had a lot to do with that, where we think in terms of 1 week, 1 month, right? How can I get rich in 1 week or 1 month? No one wants to go, well, 30 years is a good enough time frame for me to get wealthy. So everyone's looking for the home run. But the problem is that includes a lot of people that are in more desperate situations. Right? The people that have the luxury of thinking about long-term timeframes and putting together a financial plan and figuring out what the right asset allocation is for them, right? That's a luxury for a lot of people. Most people are in the paycheck to paycheck scenario in the world right now. And because of that, they're looking for the fast way, right? Well, if I get my paycheck and I put it into Trump coin and I get a 20,000x on it, right? Well, then all my problems are solved. The problem is nobody ever knows, one, when to sell, right? You got to know when things are much too good to be true. But two, you realize that you're going to lose so often in that scenario that it erodes all the value proposition for you out of it. I mean, when you look at something like Bitcoin that's returning 60% year over year, part of you has to wonder, why isn't that enough, right? In this society, when the society used to be conditioned for, 9 to 12% was a really good annual return. Now people are saying 60% is not enough. I need 2,000%. You're going, well, that's just not real. Otherwise, everyone would be a billionaire. So it's that education perspective. And I don't like seeing people that are in positions of power putting out these types of coins that we've got a lot of history to know that these tend to end poorly. And so I try to do what I can to usher people away from that and go, don't get distracted, right? Every time people see anyone else making money, they tend to run that direction. But usually by that time, you're too late, right? And you don't want to be the late entrance because then your investment erodes really quickly. So I try to tell people, focus on what you know has long-term value and you can see all the evidence of the adoption of it. And you don't need to look too broadly beyond that. With Bitcoin, it was always, well, everyone would assume we made it when corporations were involved. Well, that happened years ago. And then they said, well, no countries will get involved. Then El Salvador got involved. And then they went, well, it's just one small country. And now you've got the biggest economic power in the world starting to have these conversations. And when you look at that, you go, that adoption cycle is real and it's coming really fast, right? I don't think any of us thought that we would be in the position where the US would be talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves in 2025. That was quick. And if you're paying attention, you know that shows the value proposition that asset holds and the power that decentralization holds in a monetary network. And so I don't need to look much further than Bitcoin from that perspective, right? I can see the adoption happening, and it's happening way faster than I thought it would. So I'm not going to allow myself to get distracted by all these sideshows that are happening out here. and get myself wrapped up in all the altcoin movements again. I've been there. I've tried those. I don't see the value in them, right? I understand tokenized economies, and I think that there is probably a position in the world for tokenizing assets down the line. But right now, I try to focus on what asset is helping to solve one of the biggest problems that every individual is facing right now, which is inflation and debasement of your currency, which is going to cause people to be locked into these jobs out of desperation and not necessarily out of a passion for what they're doing. So I know what Bitcoin's aiming to solve right now. I see it as a very strong store of value, and I think people will start to see that over time. They just have to keep themselves from getting distracted.
Absolutely. And it's kind of fascinating to see all that happening and remembering like that's an open technology everyone can participate in. It's decentralized, it's globally available, a strictly capped supply, and an ever increasing demand. We never had that. Like we don't know what's happening.
Yeah, people don't know what to expect out of this, right? Because they're trying to normalize Bitcoin like every other asset that they've seen in their life. The problem is it's not like any other asset that they've seen in their life. This is the first one that you're going to see where no matter the increase in demand, there's not going to be any more supply coming to the market. And I don't think people can really conceptualize what that means to an asset like Bitcoin when you truly have a fixed supply. You know exactly how many of them are going to get released every day, right? That type of structure in an asset class is unfamiliar to most of the world. And we've never really had a true experiment where we see what happens when unlimited demand meets finite supply. And I think this is going to be the first time we're going to see it. And I don't think people are ready for what that's going to look like. I think it's going to shock most people on orders of magnitude that they're not prepared for.
Do you think also that this law of diminishing returns is kind of BS of like we will probably have a big adoption curve in front of us?
I think we have a very big adoption curve in front of us. People don't really understand how much money there is in the world, right? Because they look at it in all these different buckets, but putting together the full picture of, all the paper value that's out there as well versus, actual physical currencies. And then you've got all the digital currencies because you got fractional reserve banking, right? No one really has a full concept of just how much money there is out there. MicroStrategy has been doing a good job educating us because Seyr always puts that slide in all of his presentations showing all the different buckets where Bitcoin can extract value out of. But when you look at just a bond market with $300 trillion of value in it, right? That's tough for most people to conceptualize. And that's just the bond market, right? That's not everything beyond that. So there's a huge amount of value that can benefit from an asset like Bitcoin. And I think that slowly over time, when people start to figure out that we do have that adoption curve in front of us, I mean, keep in mind, it's only a $2 trillion asset, right? It's not a very big asset in the grand scheme of global finance. And so when you look at all these other asset classes that are so significantly underperforming Bitcoin, and then you start to learn about all the unique characteristics that Bitcoin holds, you start to really question, why wouldn't I be participating in that asset? If I've got all these underperforming corporate bonds or treasuries or whatever you're holding, and you realize that you're locked into these low single-digit returns, meanwhile, right in front of you, with no real barriers to entry, you've got the largest decentralized global monetary network that's getting interest from individuals. It's getting interest from sovereign wealth funds. It's getting interest from corporations. Now it's getting interest from nations and even the nation with a reserve currency of the world. When you see those types of things falling into place, it's tough to question, or it's tough to come to the conclusion that you shouldn't be participating in that. Because if everybody else that's controlling capital of the world is seeing value in this asset and is transitioning their value from whatever they're holding over to Bitcoin, you might want to start paying attention to that, because it's not a tough puzzle to solve to figure out why they're doing that. And when every other asset was gaining value, largely just because the currency that it's valued in is debasing, right? That's something a lot of people don't understand, is that, yes, you get things like housing values that are going up, but a large part of that is that it's just the dollar's always going down, right? So it's a denominator. that's changing, that's giving that top line value to the asset class and making them look like they're appreciating in value. But really, it's just your purchasing power eroding before your eyes. And once you come to that realization, you start looking for solutions real quick. And I think that's one of the great gifts that Bitcoin's given to the world, right? If you looked at nothing else, right? Take away all the other value that Bitcoin's providing, which is immeasurable at this point. One thing it did is it provided people with a new level of financial literacy and financial education. Until, probably the last 5-6 years, people really weren't talking about inflation and monetary debasement, and they weren't putting together the math of, all right, I'm taking one of my most finite resources, my time and my energy, and I'm applying that to a job that I'm working. Whether I want to be working that job or not, I need to, because I need the money that it provides. So I'm taking my time and my efforts, and I'm trading that for the value I'm extracting from my job in terms of my paycheck, my salary, whatever it might be. But the cycle that people get into is, all right, now once you've got that asset, first, it devalues on its own, right? Without you doing anything, immediately when you get that money, it starts devaluing on you. But then you go and do things like take that money, convert it over, I'm going to go buy a new car. So now I've taken a huge amount of that money that I earned through my time and efforts, and I bought another asset. Well, the problem with that asset is now it depreciates just even faster than inflation does. So you get into this loop, right, where you're constantly trying to extract value from your efforts, but then you're deploying it, and people are deploying it in the wrong ways that keep them in that cycle of constantly losing value in their life, and it never allows anybody to get ahead. I mean, one of the best things that someone could do, and I think one of the most freeing experiences people have, is when you finally buy your freedom from doing things you don't really want to do. And that's most people in their careers, which is really sad to think about, is that most people fall into careers purely for the reason that they have to, and this is what was going to pay me the amount that I wanted, right? That's how careers tend to move. It's really gotten out of what are you passionate about in your life and where do you think you can create the most value and provide the most value to the world. It's become these jobs of desperation, right? And you're constantly chasing these small increases in the value you're extracting out of that career. And so when people finally buy their freedom, the problem is by that time, you've spent 40 years of your life working in this job you didn't really want to work in. You're dedicating 8 hours a day. You're exhausted when you come home. You don't have time to really do any of the things you really enjoy. And so getting that education early is huge because you can make the changes early enough in your life where you get to buy back your time and your freedom so that you can deploy it in a way that energizes you, where you feel you're maximizing your abilities to provide value to the world. When you get that type of freedom in your life, that's really impactful, right? I think all the mental health issues and things that we see out there these days are largely driven to people that don't feel like they have a purpose anymore, right? You're just constantly in this cycle of struggling, and Bitcoin's giving people a way to think about that differently. And if nothing else, it's educating them on how to change some approaches in their life to start accumulating that value early on so that you can get out of that rat race sooner than you typically would. People have just accepted, particularly in the United States, that you're basically going to work in a full-time job from the time you're 40 until you're 65. Like, what a huge portion of your life if you're dedicating it to something you're not truly passionate about. And so the education that I think Bitcoin's bringing out to people, and, people putting out content like yourself and all the other great podcasters out there that are trying to really capture the value proposition of Bitcoin and bring that out to the masses, is a huge service because people weren't getting this education in school. I mean, the big joke in the US was you can go through a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, you still never get taught how to file a tax return, right? Like something basic that everybody needs to know. It doesn't even become a discussion. And so Bitcoin gives people, it puts them in an ecosystem of people that are thinking differently, right? To become a Bitcoiner early, you had to have a different mindset than everybody else did. And I think that education now that the access to that information, and there's so many people sharing their experiences and their theories and their thought process around Bitcoin, I think that's bringing a lot of the younger generation up to speed a lot faster. They've seen the issues fiat currencies are causing. They see the reckless spending coming out of governments and how they've really got very few tools to correct the path that they put themselves on based on all the debt they've accumulated. And so just that shift in society, I think, is going to be really valuable to the people that embrace it and realize what it is they have in front of them that they have access to now.
That was amazing. It's very true. I mean, I saw it with myself. I switched last year from a fiat job that I kind of liked. Actually, it was not a bad fiat job. I kind of liked it, but I switched to being in Bitcoin only and doing every day basically what I want to do with the podcast and with everything that I work in the space. It feels like retirement. When I talk to my grandpa, and he's like, oh, like I stand up and do that what I like, and this is I'm like in retirement and I make money with it.
Yeah, and you are, right? I mean, that's the thing I think most people have the misnomer of. For most people, retirement means I go sit on a beach for the rest of my life and don't do anything, right? I don't view it that way. I view it as a shift, right? You're retiring from doing things you don't want to do anymore, right? You've freed yourself up, you've bought back your time, and now in your retirement, you get to figure out what it is you're actually passionate about. It doesn't mean you stop making money or you stop putting out value into the world. It shifts where your focus is. And quite frankly, I think it's the reason why there's a lot of people that actually become more successful in retirement. Right? You're no longer tied down to a job you didn't really want to have. And luckily for you, it sounded like it was actually an enjoyable job, which is good. But for most people, you're not tied down to that anymore. And it finally frees your mind up, right? The pressures are gone of wondering how you're going to pay the next bill or make the next mortgage or rent payment, right? Whatever it is that was holding you back. And now you just get to sit down and take a few minutes to go, who am I really? And what is it that I'm really passionate about? And for a lot of us in our community, we figured out that there's this major lacking of financial education out there in the world. And we were lucky enough to be open-minded enough and have the time to really deep dive into an asset like Bitcoin to create for ourselves, how does this apply to my life? How do I change the way that I'm going to save and store the value that I've created? But then when you do figure that out, everyone has a huge group of people that they really care about. And it's one of the things I think is the most different about the Bitcoin community versus any of the other communities is I've never heard anyone running around telling their family they should sell everything they own and go all in on Ethereum. Never heard it, right? Same with Solana, never heard it. The people that really figure out Bitcoin, you're not telling strangers about Bitcoin. You're telling your parents, you're telling your siblings, you're telling your best friends, right? You're trying to help the people because you've figured out something that they haven't yet, right? You've seen the problems with the world and the model that they're operating in, and you've got a different solution to it. And you want to share that because you're trying to free up everybody in your orbit. You want everyone to benefit from the same things you are. It's not this secret that you hold, right? It's not like people when they're trading stocks and they think they found an edge and they want to be quiet about it because they don't want anyone else to get in there before them. Bitcoin, you go tell everyone, at least everyone you care about, because you see the difference it'll make in their life and you want them to move in that direction. And so I think foundationally in the Bitcoin community, that's one of the biggest differences I've ever seen, right? You don't try to push anybody you care about into something you think is a highly speculative asset. I'd never do it, right? If I didn't really believe in it, I wouldn't be telling anyone in my close circle about it. But I don't think that at all. I actually think this is probably one of the most valuable assets that's ever been created for society. And it's unique in the fact that, when Satoshi left, he left Bitcoin to the world. And from here, the world gets to figure out how we're going to integrate that asset into our society. And that's so unique because every other asset that you see out there, there's always somebody that's controlling it, right? Look at things like the diamond industry and all the control that companies like De Beers have, right? Like you've always got this centralized party that's kind of controlling, and you've got all the gold miners mining and changing the supply that they're mining to try to keep right. You get these games. Bitcoin, you don't have that. The creator just walked away and left it to the world. And, now the world gets to figure out what does peer-to-peer mean to you. And that's a beautiful gift because society is going to change, right? When Satoshi was creating Bitcoin, it was a much different world than it is today. And so Bitcoin has so many applications that I think people don't even look at, like what's going to create the financial economy between AI systems when those are out there, right? Well, you've got this great digital monetary network that's decentralized from anyone else. That would seem like a pretty good solution to it. So you're going to have all these uses out there in the world for Bitcoin that I don't even think we can conceptualize yet. But that's the beauty of it being a technology that was released to the world, is now the creativity of individuals gets to really come out and figure out, now that we have something that's truly liberated from controls of people that are bad actors often, how do we use it? How do we maximize the value to society on the rails of the strongest decentralized monetary network in the world? And that creates a very exciting outlook for the future that I think a lot of people have been missing for a very long time. And it makes me really excited about it.
And that's why we tell our loved ones. That's why we don't. And that's why it's also hard, because usually you want to orange pill them, but they usually are not as ready as you are. And then you're like trying to drill a hole in a wall that just doesn't want to be drilled, kind of.
Right. But it's the effort of caring, right? I mean, you're putting in an exorbitant amount of effort. Nobody who really believes in it gives up after the first no, right? And it does make you feel like a salesman at times. But I think that's actually part of what brings people around is, if you just went and told them about Bitcoin and then they said no and you never told them about it again, to them, it's like, all right, he was trying to sell me something. But when you keep coming back and just slowly piecing together that knowledge base for them and helping them to understand where the value is here, I mean, that becomes really powerful, because when people see you putting in that type of effort, right, particularly if you're not trying to push them into it, right? I don't ever try to push anybody into buying anything, including Bitcoin, right? Because I think if you just go buy something, it never feels secure to you, right? That's when you're going to be constantly focused on the price charts, and it goes down 10% and you start freaking out and thinking that you got into a bad investment, right? So I don't ever start there. I always start with, talking about the issues with monetary debasement and helping people understand what that means for the value of what they've saved over the lifetime of a career and how that's going to be impacted and the loss of purchasing power. I actually start there and help people understand the foundational issue that they're facing. And then from there, you can start to introduce, here's an alternative thought process. Here's an alternative asset that has some very unique qualities to it that were specifically engineered to help mitigate these problems that we're having in society. And when you do it that way, and you don't start with pushing it on people, they're much more receptive, particularly if these people respect you and respect your opinion on things, right? If you've not been trying to, sell them every token that's come out of the gate, and you're going, here's a different way to approach retaining value in your life. And you start with the foundation of the problems, you get to the solution, you explain all the different features Bitcoin has, right? The peer-to-peer capabilities, the security of the network, right? You start talking them through everything. Once you know what you're buying, right? Once I really understood what I had with Bitcoin, it's the most peaceful part of my investing life. I forget to look at it for months because it doesn't matter, because I know what I own right now and I know what the problems are broadly in the world, and I don't see those changing. So I can't come up with anything else I would rather be owning right now. And because of that, it becomes this foundational component to your entire financial life that you just don't have to spend a single minute worrying about anymore. Because as long as you believe that over a long period of time, they're going to continue to debase, the US dollar, whatever currency that you're holding on to, and you don't see governments quickly flipping a switch and becoming these efficient value creation machines that are, creating jobs like crazy, and the economies are always going to be roaring, right? As long as that's not your outlook, you feel real secure holding Bitcoin, because you know that this kind of opts you out of that system. And you go, I'm going to go with something I can truly understand, where there's not people behind the scenes pulling different levers with different self-interest that they're trying to fulfill. I want something that's separated from that, right? I want to decentralize my financial life from that type of a system. And I'm going to store my value over in this asset that I know I can count on. I know exactly how it's going to behave. There's no mysteries around it. And because of that, once I own it, I don't have to watch the price anymore. It can go down, it can go up. It's really not a big deal. I actually watch price far more on the equities that I'm investing in, which mostly are in the Bitcoin ecosystem as well. But I actually spend far more time watching those. The Bitcoin that I own, I'm not worried because I'm not doing anything with it right now, right? That is my store of value for my own personal life. And because of that, I'm just happy to let that sit in storage out there. And I don't have to spend a minute worrying about what the price action's doing because I've seen enough and I've spent enough time analyzing the financial markets and understanding the currencies to know that this is where I can feel secure. So I'll spend all my other energy on this side trying to create additional value. And maybe I won't be able to outpace Bitcoin over in that area, but it's fun to try. So I like to do that as well, right? I'm not just 100% Bitcoin, although that is the foundation of all of my investing. I think anyone that's doing their investing, you start with Bitcoin. And then on the other side, I try to have some fun and see if I can generate returns in excess of Bitcoin on the other side of my portfolio, operating it on a Bitcoin standard. So it keeps you really engaged, and it also keeps you interested in the developments that are happening out there in the corporate world as it pertains to Bitcoin.
I partnered up with Coin Vigilante. This is the most beautiful Bitcoin timepiece that I ever saw created by anyone. Look at that beauty. I love it so much. Coin Vigilante made a perfect Bitcoin watch. That's the perfect, subtle, elegant way to go out there and show that you are a Bitcoiner. And that watch brand is Bitcoin only. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece, and make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. If you watch or listen to my podcast on a regular basis, I guess you already bought some Bitcoin. And now the most important step is to keep the Bitcoin. Keep them secure in a hardware wallet. My personal recommendation for hardware wallet is the BitBox. It's super secure. It's simple to set up. It's also a perfect gift for a friend who has still their Bitcoin on an exchange. And you can get a 5% discount with the code Robin at the checkout. Visit bitbox.swiss/Robin to get your BitBox. And the next step is to really level up your sovereignty as an individual. You have to have the most secure self-custody setup. You have to secure your own devices. You have to protect your privacy. You have to set up an inheritance plan. And depending on where you live, you even want to have a plan B, a citizenship where you can move in case something goes really wrong. And through all those steps, the Bitcoin way is guiding you through step by step. And if you visit thebitcoinway.com/partners/Robin, you even get a 30-minute free call to find out how you can level up your sovereignty. Are you doing that with Bitcoin plays like MicroStrategy, or also with completely outside of the Bitcoin realm companies like, I don't know, like Tesla, Nvidia, or something like that?
So it largely got to MicroStrategy, and that'll be no surprise to anyone who knows me and what I cover, is that I got into MicroStrategy initially, largely not because I understood their strategy at all. I really didn't, and it wasn't clear in the early days what it was they were doing, other than they converted their treasury over to Bitcoin, and that was kind of the first step. But I got into them because I looked at it as, I've been in Bitcoin long enough that what I'm looking for is corporate adoption. So I'm going to support any company that's supporting Bitcoin. That was really the entirety of my thesis early on, which is a hilarious way to invest. So when they converted their treasury, I said, I'm in, right? I'll take this ride. So I bought into MicroStrategy. And then over time, when you saw them really foundationally changing the way that corporations operate to create value and to return value to shareholders, it didn't take all that long to go, well, wait a second, there's something else happening here, right? This isn't just we don't hold dollars anymore. This is the pursuit of active accumulation of digital capital, right? And Seyr was always doing a really good job explaining that. But, like most people, I'm not immune to it. It took me a while to figure out what he was saying. I didn't really know, and I couldn't figure it out. You're taking on debt, and you're buying Bitcoin, and you can conceptually understand the arbitrage opportunity there, but you start to think the way everyone else does, and you go, well, that's really risky, right? Like you're betting the farm on this. And when you're using traditional debt, that's very true, right? If you're tied into banks, those bank loans come with a lot of strings, right? There's a lot of covenants that are in place around loan to values on collateral, around debt service coverage. So you got to have a certain amount of cash flow that can cover the debts that you owe to them. And usually that's like you have to have twice the amount of your debt coverage, something in that range. And so that part initially scared me because I came from commercial banking. That was my first job out of college. I was a credit analyst at a regional bank, and that was right during the financial crisis. And so quickly when I got into the bank, I started as a credit analyst, but then it turned out so much of the bank was non-performing loans that I shifted and I started working, and it was called the Special Assets Group, right? What a great name. But it was basically all the unperforming loans of the bank. These were the risk areas to the bank failing, and banks were failing all the time. So my job was to underwrite and monitor all these non-performing loans, come up with restructuring agreements, collect on collateral if we needed to. So I saw the downside of having debt and then getting yourself into a situation where you couldn't cover it. I knew what that meant. And so when I first saw MicroStrategy make that shift, it concerned me a little bit. And I didn't really understand it. And even, I think I was right to be a little concerned. And then when you had all the issues with Silvergate, everyone else started looking too, going, there's a lot of risk in that type of an approach. So it was a huge sigh of relief when I watched them shift that strategy from using traditional bank debt into using things like convertible bond offerings, because you change the risk profile of the investment drastically. So, MicroStrategy became this interesting story of corporate adoption because it wasn't just about corporations, wanting to own Bitcoin instead of cash. Theirs was this pursuit of value using the capital markets to create it for them, right? It was a shift from the focus on the income statement and trying to build your core product offering and generate higher net income returns year over year, which is how most corporations are valued, right? You look at the income statement and every analyst is looking for top line growth, bottom line growth, margin growth. MicroStrategy shifted, and you can think about it like an individual when you look at things like your job versus your retirement accounts, right? One of them, you're spending all your time focusing on trying to get a 5 or a 10% raise year over year on your salary. But then eventually you accumulate enough assets on your balance sheet where you go, maybe my efforts aren't best spent on 5% of my income. Maybe 5% is a much more drastic number if I find 5% more return on the value of my balance sheet, right? Both create value in my life, but one actually creates more. And so MicroStrategy saw that because they had this struggling core business where they're competing with these, huge corporations like Microsoft for these BI products. And they saw that that's a really tough business to be in, and it's a really tough business to grow in. But they had a very unique position where they had this really clean balance sheet, right? They had tons of financial assets, right? It was lots of cash. They were fairly unencumbered by debt, at least not any debt that they couldn't get rid of. And so that made them a really unique story for this Bitcoin accumulation strategy because they had the ability to transform their balance sheet to have this massive reliance on Bitcoin. And what Seyr figured out long before anybody else did was that Bitcoin, being a new and emerging asset class, comes with inherent volatility and significant volatility. And he figured out that he could change the way people looked at his company, where they're no longer looking at them necessarily for the BI business and just focusing on the growth of the BI business. What he could do was he could make their balance sheet almost entirely reliant on Bitcoin, the asset. And with that comes the volatility profile to the equity that Bitcoin brings. So with Bitcoin being 60, I think the implied volatility now is something like 64, 65. He said just that alone is significantly more volatility than most equities have, right? Most will be in that 10 to 15 range. So then he took it a step further and he said, well, what if instead of focusing, just on that BI business, what if we created a different vertical, right? What if we created a new product out of our company? And to do that, he said, let's take the volatility that Bitcoin offers. We're going to make our balance sheet comprised almost entirely of Bitcoin. We don't have a lot of other big fixed assets that are clogging up the balance sheet. So almost entirely Bitcoin. Then we're going to take out additional leverage, right, through different debt or fixed income instruments, and we're going to buy more Bitcoin. So now our balance sheet's not just comprised 100% of Bitcoin. Now it's levered on top of that Bitcoin. And what he figured out was that what he was doing was engineering a new product. And that new product was the equity. He was creating this universally desirable trading instrument for all types of capital, right? All investors need volatility to generate returns, right? It's that movement in the market that allows people in long positions to make money, short positions to make money. If you're trading derivatives, you make money on the move, right? It created this unique product that the market really doesn't have today. And he did that using Bitcoin and the volatility that Bitcoin brings. So it quickly made me very interested in that company because it was clear people weren't understanding what was happening. People were looking at it as just this risky bet. And, it's running way up and it's crashing. And that freaks a lot of people out. But when you start to see what they're engineering over there, it starts to change your perception of that equity. So it was that shift in thinking that really made that one of the core equities that I trade. I do trade some other things. I'm interested in the emergence of, AI, and I like energy plays because I think energy is going to be a big asset. So I do trade in other things as well, but it's become very narrow, right? I got well out of the normal portfolio, which I had before, which was just own a bunch of index funds and you just hope you get your 10 to 12% returns a year. And everything's great. I got well away from that because now I'll only invest in things that I'm deeply committed to understanding. And really, I think that's the only edge you can find in the market these days because most people are investing blindly. They don't really know what they own. So I try to make sure that I'm only investing in the things I truly understand so that I think really does bring an edge because you can be long-term about those types of companies when you know what the model is and what they're trying to accomplish.
It shocks me when I speak with friends and when I speak with people that I know outside of Bitcoin and ask them, okay, like where, like, okay, if not Bitcoin, where do you put your money? And then they say stuff like they have some companies, they have an ETF, they have whatever. And I ask them one simple question, it's like, oh, like, what's your thesis behind that? And there's like usually like a 2-sentence answer to that. I'm like, that's it. Like that's where you're putting your life savings. Like, yeah, it can be a good play, but like you should be like, you should at least be educated about it.
It's amazing how comfortable people get investing in things they have no idea about, right? Like if you went and someone who's buying the S&P 500, and you gave them that list of companies. And I didn't really understand this until I started seeing the list, right? While people started tracking the more MicroStrategy falls in terms of the companies that are in the S&P 500. And you start seeing all these names pop up and you go, I don't have any idea what that company does. And it was the majority of them. I'd never heard of them before. And so you start to think like, if I'm just buying this ETF product that's comprised of these 500 companies, and I probably can't name 75% of them or tell you what they do, why am I investing in that? Right? Why is that a good alternative to me than something I understand deeply? Right? So, and then when you start digging a little further and you go, well, there's like 7 companies that make up the entirety of the return, which means that the other 593 companies are just a drag on, or 493 companies are just a drag on the overall return profile of that product. Well, why would I buy that? Right? Why wouldn't I just buy the 7 that are giving me returns? Why am I blending it with all this other stuff that doesn't make any money and generates no returns, has no volatility to it? So you really do have to question your own investing when you start to understand these things and rationalize it for yourself. And if you can't, you've got a bit of a problem on your hands. Investing blindly isn't a way to success, right? It's why if you go and you generate the S&P 500 returns, but you adjust it for inflation, it's basically flat. It's done nothing, right? And so when you see that, you go, oh my gosh, like it's a game. right? You're just basically keeping up. You can basically view the S&P 500 as monetary debasement, right? That's really kind of your benchmark return. And so it's a shift in the way you think about all of your investments that you're going to take. And it's amazing how impactful that becomes, right? After you track it and you make that change, and then you start tracking your returns relative to the S&P 500, and you start to almost, sometimes you outperform in almost a scary way. Like it starts to almost make you question, like it's too good sometimes. And I don't know, like I can't say that that keeps up forever. I don't know, right? I mean, things go in cycles. You've got global liquidity cycles that impact markets, and right now Bitcoin falls into the risk asset profile, right? So I mean, I'm not blind to those connections, and that's a real thing. But when you take out all the drags in your portfolio and you start looking at where the world's going instead of where it is today, it can really make you more excited about building that profile, because now you're looking for the areas that you see the value coming in the next 5, 10, 15 years versus, what's worked for the last 30, because we're in a very different world today than we were 30 years ago. So a lot of those names that have basically transitioned themselves into dividend paying stocks, which just essentially tells you they're out of ideas to generate value. So they're just going to give the money back because they can't come up with any better ways to deploy it. Right. That's a little scary, because that became such a profound part of investing for people, was they were looking for that income component, that dividend payment, but they never really understood what that meant. Right. You have to think about, why would a company just be giving you money back? Right. You have to think about that and connect those dots, and you go, oh my gosh, they're out of ideas. They've got maybe a strong business for today that generates a ton of cash flow, and because of that, they can return value to shareholders just by giving it back. But Seyr made a pretty good argument for, well, why wouldn't you take that money that you don't have a better idea for and inject growth into your company through an asset like Bitcoin? You don't even have to invest in building a new product or standing up this department full of people and research and development teams and sales teams. You don't have to do any of that. You can inject growth into your business and into your balance sheet simply by taking the largest decentralized monetary network and injecting that growth into your business that's returning 60%, right? What's better for shareholders, giving them that dividend or allowing that to compound at 60% a year? The math's really easy. So I think it's going to become unavoidable for corporations ultimately, and it's almost going to become negligent here pretty shortly for these boards not to at least consider this as a part of the strategy for their organization, because it's being proven out over and over again, the value that this asset's returning. And it's also showing value in that volatility that it can bring to your equity when you have this as a part of your core business now. And so I think that's going to become this unavoidable discussion point where, if your board's not at least talking about it and trying to figure out what this means for your company long term and what it means to not participate, that's the question I would love to start seeing more boards answer that are saying no to this is, what's your thesis on why it's better not to participate in this? Because what if you're in an industry that's got, 5 companies in it, and you're all relatively the same size, and one company adopts Bitcoin as their treasury reserve asset, and all the other ones just go on status quo, paying out dividends to their investors. Fast forward 10 years. Which company in that peer group do you think is probably more powerful? It's probably the one that made that shift, right? Really understood they're now not only just retaining the value within the organization by not paying out the dividend, they're investing that into a new growth instrument, and then they're compounding that value. They might be the company that ends up owning the other 4 companies, right? They might become that powerful. So you have to look at it from an organizational perspective as to what are the risks not to participate. And that risk is that your peers pass you up in a significant way, where they're now so much more well capitalized that their flexibility for growth in the future, whether that be through, acquisitions or new products or whatever, they're going to have the capital to have that flexibility to reinvent themselves. Because as a corporation, if you're not in a constant state of transformation, you're dying, right? No company gets to stay static forever. The world changes. The types of products people need change. The innovation just within your industry changes that makes products you've offered obsolete. So if your organization's not in a constant state of transformation, you're going to fall behind your peer groups. And that's why so many companies cease to exist. But if you make a shift now and you say, maybe we don't have an idea today, but what we're going to do is we're going to take our strong business and we're going to preserve the value we're generating today. And we're going to put that into digital capital, which we think is the capital of the future. And we're going to allow that to continue its compounding trajectory. Maybe it keeps getting 60%, maybe it drops down to 25%, whatever it is. We're going to keep compounding that value on our balance sheet. So when the time comes and we see that next opportunity, we're going to be so well capitalized that there's nothing that's going to be able to stop us from executing on that idea. Right. And I think that that's a big shift that a lot of companies and a lot of boards at companies are going to need to make, because there's a lot of complacency out there and they need to start being more forward looking than they've had to be in the past.
I love that so much. I never looked at dividends as a sign of a company kind of slowing down and running out of ideas. That's an amazing. I was a stock investor before Bitcoin, and I naturally avoided dividend things because they never had any stories, I feel like, but I never connected those dots of like, why don't I like dividends and like the growth stocks more, because the dividend payers usually don't have that big of a growth story anymore.
Good thing is your instincts were correct, so it kept you away. But they have a place for some people, right? You have to respect that every individual has a different risk profile they're willing to invest in. The difference is for people that are like us, we don't see areas that are connected to Bitcoin as being risky. I actually view it as the ultimate risk-off asset, right? I'm taking all the centralized control and all the games out of it. So I view it as the ultimate going risk-off asset, right? I feel like I'm a value investor, right? I'm investing in the most valuable asset I can find. But for other people, they need cash flows as a sign of life. It's the only thing that matters to them. And these dividend paying stocks that are just generating a lot of cash and giving it back, that feels good in their life. Maybe they need that cash flow. Maybe that's how they're funding their life, right? Everyone's got different situations. But I do think it's a great question people have to ask themselves when they review their own portfolios. And you go, why do I own this? And what do I think? Like, if they're giving me all this cash back, why? Why are they giving me all this cash back? They're a big company. They've always been a innovative company. They at least created a product that was good enough to create this core business that's throwing off all this cash flow. Why aren't they continuing to build and make it better, right? What are they doing? And being able, at least in your own personal investing life, to ask that question is a very powerful tool, because it shifts how you view all the value that you're holding in your portfolio. And it makes you go through that exercise of rationalizing, why am I in this investment? What is it about this company that I think makes it a good thing for me to hold over the next decade, right? How do I see them being a better company 10 years down the road than they are today? And when you stop being able to answer that question, if you've got, 5 years of evidence that says they're just going to keep doing the same thing forever now, to me, that's not a good long-term investment, because if I don't see a company constantly evolving and adapting to the world changing around them, that's not something I'm comfortable holding for 10 years, because innovation's happening at lightning speeds now. And if you ignore that trend, you're going to fall behind, and your portfolio is going to ultimately end up underperforming what all these other companies are, because the big names today in stocks are not going to be the big names in 10 years. Look how fast companies like Google and Meta and NVIDIA, look at how fast they all rose. They came out of nowhere seemingly, right? And now they're such core parts of our world today that you can almost not remember back to the time where they didn't exist, but it wasn't that long ago. So if you think that the trend is going to be different for the next 20 years, and all of a sudden the world's going to take a breather and just pause, and no new innovation is going to come, and no new mega corporations are going to show up, that's just detached from reality, right? Innovation is going to happen at the speed of light, and we're going to see far more than we probably saw in the past. So you've got to be ready to adapt with the times.
That's super interesting. One thing that like, Michael Saylor has his price models, like there's power loss model. There's so many different tries out there of like how to model the growth of Bitcoin, and the price of Bitcoin is kind of just a function of that, because it has like the component of how how is Bitcoin growing and how fast is the US dollar devaluing. It's like those two aspects are kind of controlling of where the Bitcoin price is going. How do you look at the growth level of Bitcoin in the coming future? We hear, I think, like BlackRock was the one that said like it's growing faster than mobile phones and the internet. And they brought up something. How do you look at how fast Bitcoin will grow in the coming years? And obviously that also impacts the price, but there's also more aspects to that.
Yeah, I think all the models, like, they're good. Right. It's good to have models because it helps you to conceptualize the scale of the opportunity that's out there. I don't prescribe myself to any individual growth model that's out there because I don't think we know, right? With most of these models, we're taking historical performance and we're trying to project it forward to give us some conceptual idea for what that growth rate's going to look like. And I think it's good for people to understand the opportunity, but I think sometimes when you get tied into too many models, you start to put yourself more in the mindset of a trader again. And when you're looking at that and you see things like these price bands that price is probably going to operate in, well, that gets you into the mindset of, okay, well, when it gets to the top of the band, I'm going to sell out and then I'll be able to buy more down. And the answer to that is maybe. But we don't know yet because I think that the speed that adoption curve is going to come is going to blow a lot of people's minds. If you just look at, the number of countries that are out there, right? If we just focus on nation state adoption for this asset, and you look at how many countries have given up their ability to have their own fiat currency, they've dollarized themselves or they've pegged themselves to some other currency, you've got a problem if you're those countries now. If a country like the United States, and you've seen all the talk in the BRICS nations about them potentially using Bitcoin to settle trade, right? When you see all the powerful economies in the world shifting into this area where they're becoming favorable towards Bitcoin, and they're looking at utilizing a decentralized asset like Bitcoin, which became really eye-opening when the US weaponized the SWIFT network against Russia. That right there was an advertisement to all these nation states to make sure that they make themselves resilient in the event that they get on the wrong side of some of the powers in the world. So now you've got to look at it. If you're a nation, you have to evaluate your financial standing, because what you don't have the luxury of is the ability to print your own currency to buy the asset you can't print. So if you've already given that up, you've got to essentially make this move before countries like the United States and Russia and China and all these big superpowers out there, before they start accumulating. You essentially need to get there first because you don't have the ability to print your own currency to buy Bitcoin. They do. So they are price agnostic buyers. They'll buy it at any price because they're essentially buying it with something they create, right? It really doesn't matter. But if you're a company that has dollarized yourself, you do have a finite amount of currency within your country. So you're looking at this, if you're looking at it strategically, you're going, I might have an opportunity right now to front run the superpowers, right? Before their capital comes and starts acquiring this network that's not tied to any country, right? I could start acquiring that today, and I will get the economic benefit of their purchasing power later. So when you look at a country like El Salvador that really picked up on this very quickly and went in a big way, they're going to totally change their economic standing in the world because of that shift. And other smaller countries are going to start to realize that if they're the last ones left holding the currency that's devalued in such a significant way, their country is going to be significantly worse off than it is now, because they're not going to have the ability to make that transition in a way that's advantageous to themselves. So when I start game theorying out what that looks like, I just see this rapid adoption curve, right? The question everyone's arguing about is, when does it start, right? What is that catalyst that kicks off that major steep part of an adoption curve? And I think just the fact that the US is even talking about it is probably going to get it there rather quickly. But because we're short term in nature, people are looking for, does it start day one of a presidency? Is it day two? Right? I don't necessarily think of those terms, but I think of, do I see it as being more likely than not in the next 2 years? Yeah, absolutely. Probably quicker. But I think that shift in the fact that it's not taboo to talk about for a country like the United States anymore, that's going to give a level of confidence to nations that they can start adopting it, and further down the chain to corporations to say, if they're thinking about it, we should definitely be thinking about it. And so the pools of capital that keep opening up to Bitcoin are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I look at that and go, for right now, I just want to be in the asset. I'm not going to try to time this because I don't know. And I don't think anybody else does either. You can build me all the models in the world. I don't think you're going to be able to call this adoption curve in the way people think that they're going to be able to. And that's okay. I like that people are building these models because I think it creates some interesting, data points that people can use, and it gives people a long-term horizon to look at sometimes, which I think is really necessary because of that short-term focus that we have. But to me, I just look at all the catalysts that I see on the horizon for the big pools of capital that are still outside of this ecosystem. And in my mind, I try to think through, when are the incentives going to be aligned correctly for that capital to enter the market? And I think we're getting pretty close to that now. And so I look for that adoption curve to probably kick off sooner than later. We're already in it. I mean, let's not pretend that we're not. But the race to get into it, to buy the finite asset, is going to be on faster and more powerful than people think it's going to come. So it's more about being in position versus trying to time that position, because if you miss it, it's not going to be good, right? You don't want to be on the back end of an adoption curve. You'd like to be on the front end of an adoption curve. So you're still very much on the front end of the adoption curve today, but nobody can promise how long that's going to last.
That's very true. And also the point that you're making about the dangerous game of trying to time the market, meaning trying to sell some or all of your Bitcoin just to buy big more. That's the most dangerous game you could possibly play because you don't know when all of a sudden Apple, you're selling because you think it's going down. All of a sudden Apple is issuing like some quarterly thing and saying like, oh, like, yeah, we converted 20% of our balance sheet to Bitcoin because it's the best possible play. I don't think that's happened anytime soon, but it's possible. And then Bitcoin is ripping 3x and you can never buy yourself back in.
Yeah. And I had that in my own life, right? I mean, I do think you learn that lesson over time. Like the very first time I ever bought Bitcoin was in November 2013, I think was the first time I found it. And it was like $264, something to that range. And so I bought a bunch of Bitcoin at the time, and then it went up to 1,300 real quickly after that. And I sold it, and I thought I was the most brilliant trader of all time, right? Well, now if you look back at that, you go, well, that was stupid, right? Like I had no idea what I owned. I saw it in a newspaper article of all places. And so I got a Coinbase account and I was able to buy it. And, I made the joke with my dad going, well, maybe we should just buy 1,000 of these and see what happens, and we didn't. But like everyone gets into that cycle where you think you're a trader first and you think that's what making money means. And over time, you realize that, there's a reason why people always say the dead man portfolio performs the best, right? It takes all the emotion out of it. You're buying things that you're comfortable in holding for a long time period, and you just let time and adoption trends take care of everything for you, right? That's the better way to invest. But everyone always starts as a trader. Some people are very skilled at trading and others aren't. Most people get really emotional about trades, and it causes them to enter and exit at really bad times, right? You'll only buy into something when it's really exciting and the price has been running and you see everybody else making all this money, but by then you're usually too late. And then you'll sell out at the bottom when you can't take the losses anymore, right? And so you're in this perpetual state of chasing things and capitulating on things. When you find something you really do believe in, you don't want to trade it. You want to acquire it. And then you want to hold it for a really long period of time. And that's what's going to generate that excess value for you over time versus the people that, get impatient and have to constantly be trading in and out of something. Because trying to time cycles it's tough work. I know that Bitcoin's been a pretty predictable 4-year cycle, but you do look at, what does happen when that adoption curve really ramps up, what does happen when all these big pools of capital come in, when they're buyers that are agnostic to cycles, right? They're accumulators. They're holding it as a strategic asset. That's a different kind of buyer than we've had in the last cycles, right? Just go back 4 years from now, and how many new corporate entities and government entities and all these different entities and different pools of capital have entered into this marketplace. I always like to follow that Bitcoin Treasury's website, and the growth that's been in there is just incredible. The ETFs now exist. Those didn't used to be around. Like, we are entering a different period with a different type of buyer that's entered the market. I do think that has some impact on cycles. I'm not saying there won't be a cycle, because I do believe those become a little self-fulfilling for a lot of people, because Bitcoin's price, it trades at the margins, right? It's the Bitcoin that's moving. And so if you get this huge retail base that's decided that, in October, the cycle is going to peak and it's going to start coming down, you'll definitely get people that are front running that just in case, right? But those aren't the people that really understand the value proposition of Bitcoin, right? I've rode this thing through several cycles now, right? They don't bother me in the least because, one, they became very predictable, so you knew what they looked like. But two, you see all the new entrants to the market and it's a different buyer profile. And I think you have way more people with way more capital today that are prepared to buy a dip than you had, in the prior cycles that we've had. So that profile's changing. And I think with that will come some changes in the cycles. Some people will still try to time it. I'm just not going to be one of those people. I know what I own. I don't feel like giving it up. I think it's got a really, really long life ahead of it in terms of the adoption curve for Bitcoin. And so the only thing I want to be doing is owning it and accumulating more of it. That's my strategy. I'm not going to trade it.
That's the best strategy probably you can have for the next like 10, 20 years. Do you see Bitcoin as a retirement tool, as like your retirement savings vehicle, as your safe haven for when you're like 60, 70, 80 years old at one point?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's kind of the value floor for my portfolio is in Bitcoin. And so I do view it as a savings vehicle for the future, right? I do think it's the best store of value that we have out there right now. I also look at the development of the financial networks around it, right? Right now, Bitcoin's been kind of siloed off from the traditional financial services, right? All the banks and all these other entities, but that's going to change over time. And when that changes, you'll have different ways to access the value that you hold in that portfolio instead of just having to sell Bitcoin and be out of it. So I look at that adoption as well, going all these different financial services corporations, when they get clearance from regulators to get into this market and start developing products around this market, I think that it becomes a very flexible asset because it's the best collateral that you could hold if you're one of those institutions. And so I feel very confident in holding this for a long period of time because I think it's just going to become more ingrained into the traditional financial systems of the world, which is going to make accessing the value. And if I want to go transact, then I'll be able to, maybe I can borrow against Bitcoin, but I can get the money in US dollars. I can spend the US dollars, but I'm still holding onto my Bitcoin. And if that value keeps increasing, then my loan's essentially devaluing over time, right? I do see a lot of flexibility coming down the line for people like that. So I think it's one of those assets you definitely want to own going into the future, because when you're borrowing, you're not getting taxed on that, right? That's a different setup for using that value versus selling it. And if you sell it, you're giving up all the appreciation that can come in the future on it. So I view it as a very foundational savings technology for my own portfolio. I'm very optimistic about the developments that are going to come, and I do think it's going to ingrain itself more in the traditional financial systems. And I think that is important. I know that Bitcoin was always this kind of rebellion asset for a very long time, but I think when you're starting to look for the mass adoption aspects of Bitcoin, you need to have services that feel familiar to most people. And I think that's important to get them to participate in the network, is to have a service with entities that feel and look like what they're used to, where they don't have to learn this entire new language to participate. I do think that's important. I still think that being able to hold the asset on your own is one of the most important aspects of it, but I'm not so myopic that I think that everybody is going to want to do that. I just don't believe everybody's going to go down the self-custody rabbit hole. But once those services come in and you can truly start to live your life on a Bitcoin standard, I think that's a transformational shift that we don't have yet today. We have a lot of services that are out there that focus on the savings aspect of Bitcoin, right? Helping you get set up in multi-sig vaults and helping you get into a Bitcoin retirement account, like a Bitcoin IRA. Like we have a lot of services coming out like that. And we've got a few like Strike that are now allowing you to do bill pay, where you can hold all your assets in Bitcoin and then they'll sell a piece of it when the bill comes due and they take care of tracking all the taxes for you. I think that's a big shift, but nobody's fully connected that ecosystem yet, right? To make it where you've got a one-stop shop for retail individuals to participate in the Bitcoin network from a retirement savings perspective, from a savings account perspective, hold their checking account as Bitcoin, pay their bills out of an account that's tied to Bitcoin, right? That full cycle of how you live your financial life. We're getting very close. All these products are becoming very good, but I'm still waiting to see which one connects the dots to make it so that you've got a one-stop shop for an individual to participate in the Bitcoin ecosystem through the entirety of their financial life, right? Everything from what they're spending today to how they're saving for near term, how they're saving for long term, and what they're putting in for retirement, right? I want to see that full connection. And then you've got the borrowing aspect, which is a little taboo because we had such a bad experience with that in the not so distant past, right? I mean, a lot of us that were in here, we probably got caught as well. I did. It's so you're trying to participate in this ecosystem, but a lot of times it's been run by bad actors, which is the problem. But I see that shifting, and that shift away from the bad actors, where now you do have some regulation coming in that's going to prevent that type of activity. You've got more public companies that have disclosures and audits. When you start to see them participating in the ecosystem, I think that people are going to feel much more comfortable adopting it into their own personal life. So I think it's coming. But it's just going to take us a little bit.
Absolutely, and you said the rebellion story, and it's really interesting because I think if we have this revolutionary story, this rebellion story, a part of that story has to be that traditional financial space comes into the space, and because if we're always just an outside thing, there's never rebellion, there's never revolution going on. It's always it's just an outside thing. And then it's just, I don't know what it is. Then we have to revolutionize, we have to infiltrate the traditional financial space. So we have to have BlackRock coming into space. We have to have all the ETFs and companies into the space. And most importantly, Bitcoin is for enemies. Like who are we to decide who adopts Bitcoin? So like that whole story, like I don't buy it. Like that's completely BS for me. If so like, oh, I don't like that BlackRock is buying Bitcoin. I don't like that everyone listens to Michael Seyr. Yeah, Bitcoin is for enemies.
Really, it's the ultimate nod to success when they do start adopting, right? Because their incentive structure is not aligned to welcome this asset in, right? When you look at all these banks, Bitcoin is not what they wanted. But what it shows when they end up having to adopt it is that we were right. And now that value propositions become so loud that they're forced to participate, right? Whereas before they resisted, right? They resisted, they lobbied, they put all kinds of money behind trying to stop it. None of it worked, right? The greatest transformations are going to happen through some acts of rebellion. Bitcoin's going to be no different, right? It started with this underground shadowy group and everyone thought that they were, crazy and it was only for criminals and blah, blah. And all you're realizing is that some of those people are the ones that see the value first, right? Before anyone else is willing to. And so when all the institutions are slanted towards keeping this asset out, and now within just a period of 15 years, it's in, and they have to capitulate and say, well, this is going to be a part of the financial framework of society. What a victory, right? I mean, I don't think people realize how big of a deal that is for these types of companies to have to start actively looking to participate in this network. It is the ultimate sign that it's succeeding and that they now have no other choice but to participate or be left behind. And so it's really a big victory. I know it's not always going to feel like it for some of the really early adopters. They wanted it to stay this, cypherpunk asset, but When you do give a gift like this to the world and you walk away, you don't get to ring fence its utilization anymore, right? It's up to the world now to evolve around this asset and take all the qualities. And it's up to us as a community to help people to understand what the value proposition is in those qualities and how to participate in it in a maximal way. That I think that gives us a lot of purpose moving forward to make sure that we continue to get that message out there. We continue to keep pushing this thing forward, and we continue to keep an eye on these institutions and the way that they're going to participate, so that if it's going in a direction that people don't like, it's all about the messaging, getting that message out early, making people understand what's either good about this or what's dangerous about this, and how you keep your sovereignty versus how you're giving it up sometimes if you're not willing to do things like self-custody, right? There's a big story that's out there here, and every individual is going to figure out how it ingrains into the fabric of their own life. And from that perspective, everyone can move forward utilizing the value that this asset brings to the world. So it's exciting times that we're in. Nothing's going to be boring in the next decade.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk way more about MicroStrategy, but we kind of got sidetracked by a lot of other discussions. One thing I want to ask about MicroStrategy, or like indirectly about MicroStrategy, is they kind of put a leverage play on Bitcoin. Do you recommend that on individual levels to a lot of people? Kind of like, oh, I also have income, I also want to play this MicroStrategy game. But like the convertible notes, as you already mentioned, is a little bit different than like the usual consumer debt. How do you approach the MicroStrategy strategy on an individual level?
Yeah, so I'm usually not a big proponent of people taking out more debt in their personal lives. I know that's kind of become a big thing. And even Seyr said it, right? Like, go mortgage your house up, buy more Bitcoin, right? And historically, he's been correct, right? No doubt about it. The thing that I've found is there's a part of your life where you need peace once in a while. And if you're really leveraging yourself up, you're really exposed to movements in the market. And the problem is there's going to be a lot of people that aren't really in a position to leverage themselves up that are going to try to do it thinking that they're going to beat the market. And when that happens and you're taking out that traditional debt, like I said, sometimes that does come with triggers that can cause things like liquidations. It all depends on where you're borrowing it, what type of assets you're borrowing against, how those are secured. So I think peace of mind is also very valuable, right? While Bitcoin's the ultimate store of value, your mental sanity is also very important. So I'm never out there telling people to go lever themselves up and try to buy more Bitcoin with it, because I think that debt in our society can be really dangerous for people. And some people will get to the point where now they're living their life kind of on the razor's edge, where if something goes wrong and your job gets downsized and you lost the income that you had to support that debt, now you're out there selling off your assets, trying to recover and stabilize yourself. And I think that you need to have yourself freed up from some of those burdens to really be able to enjoy life around you, to be able to weather the storms when they come. If you don't have any of those points of weakness in your life, things get really stable and you don't need to, be so concerned all the time. And I think that that's worth a lot. So mathematically, is it a good strategy? Yeah, probably. Right. I mean, again, if the debt's devaluing over time, yeah, financially, it's probably a good strategy. But I try to balance, pure mathematics against mental clarity, stability in your own life, keeping yourself in a good headspace, because I think if you keep your mind in a good place, you're free to make the best decisions you can, and you're not reacting to things anymore, right? So no, I personally am not a proponent of levering up and taking on a bunch of consumer debt and doing all these things to buy Bitcoin. I see too many scenarios where people aren't actually prepared for what that means in their life. And they're going to spend far too much time having to monitor that and make sure they've got the right cash flow coming in. And they're going to try to lever up as much as they possibly can because they've heard that narrative. I just think that from an emotional state perspective, it's a little dangerous for most people to adopt. If you're doing it well within your means and you're trying to apply a little extra, I don't have any issue with that. And if you're someone that can handle it, I mean, great. I mean, have at it. I'm not telling anyone what to do in that perspective, but I just think for the bulk of people, it'll end up being more stressful to them than it might be worth to them. So I don't do a lot of the personal leverage stuff.
Peace of mind is the ultimate asset that you can hold. That's like the time in your life that's even more valuable than Bitcoin itself.
Exactly. That's why I own MicroStrategy, right? I'll let him do all the leveraged plays for me, right? He's got access to different tools than I have. His tools are non-recourse. Most of mine would not be, right? So, there's some differences in structure there that make a difference. But I do the leveraged part in my investing life. I'm just not going to go and over lever myself, doing, cash advances and remortgaging up my house and trying to find every asset I own that I can borrow money against. That's just not my approach. I like stability. I try to live a very calm, peaceful existence in my own life. So I just stay away from it.
Which brings me to one more topic. It's time preference. And you mentioned it, I think, in the beginning of the show where you said like, oh, people want 2000% next week in some assets. Now we have Bitcoin, which gives you the peace of mind, gives you still a lot of growth, but in a very safe manner. What do you think is the global impact of Bitcoin on our society if actually has this mainstream adoption, if we actually have a huge penetration point and we kind of switch that time preference around, or is it just money and it doesn't really change a whole lot in society?
Society is always very interesting, right? Because we're very short-term incentive driven. And that comes to us from all different angles, right? We've always had within our careers, you're always looking at 1-year cycles on the long end before you're getting to where you need to be focusing on trying to get that next raise, right? And you're trying to make your case for your bonus. And so you're constantly aligning your life to that cycle because it impacts you personally. When you look at corporations are always tied to the next quarter's earnings. So they have to be very short-term focused in nature because they're trying to engineer the best outcome over a 3-month period. So in the financial world, everything in our lives has been geared around short-term success, right? It's how we measure success these days. Getting people to think long-term about their savings activities is going to be a journey. I'm not under any disillusion here that Bitcoin is going to immediately fix that. I do think that you're still going to get the mania component of Bitcoin where everyone's coming in thinking they're going to get rich quick on it, right? I do think that that's probably going to be a part of that adoption story. But it's going to come with that adoption curve on the education side as well, where I think over time, people's mindset's going to change on that. And when you get one asset like Bitcoin that you can focus on the stability aspect of your savings journey into, I think that that'll make it a little easier for people to shift their mindsets into, all right, this is focused on long-term value preservation, right? You can still have the other aspects of your portfolio where you're trying for, short-term gains, right? There's a lot of ways to scratch that itch out there in the financial markets. But once people get into Bitcoin and they start to really learn about what it is that they have, and this is going to speed up because mainstream media is going to start really talking about Bitcoin. And over time, that message is going to get refined around the value preservation aspects of Bitcoin. And I think people will start to shift their mindset towards being more forward looking because I think they'll be able to. Once you finally start preserving your value in an asset like Bitcoin and you start getting that cushion in your life where you can breathe and you can decompress for a second because you're not in this constant state of financial panic, now you get the ability to start looking further out into the future. And I think that that's going to be one of the most important aspects that Bitcoin brings back to humanity is that long-term outlook, right? The ability to actually be optimistic looking out into the future and seeing there being some brighter spots out there ahead of you versus right now where you just have to be heads down and making sure you're secure for next week or 2 weeks from now. That's a shift. So I think Bitcoin's going to bring that level of liberation to a lot of people's lives that don't have it today. So I think it's going to be very, very important to people's journey when they start participating in Bitcoin to take the moment to understand what it is that they're getting into and to figure out that Bitcoin isn't a tomorrow asset or a next week asset. It's a next decade asset. It's a next millennium asset. And once they get that mind shift in there, I think it'll become much easier for people to start focusing on the future again.
I love that. Yeah. I have one question that I ask each and every one of my guests. And the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
So the thing that I hope people learn the most from me, whether they, watch my videos or they're watching my posts, is I hope they learn the freedom to allow themselves to think differently than other people. We've gotten into a big period of groupthink in the world where we get our information in sound bites. And what that does very quickly is it dissolves your own personal curiosities for every aspect of your life. And so one of the core things that I try to always focus on is taking any topic that I see out there and I try to take all the other opinions off the table. Just don't even look at them and try to evaluate it just objectively from my own life experiences, right? We all have our thought processes that are learned based on how our life has evolved to this point. And I think that that's a really good gift that the world gives us because it brings us so many different outlooks. And when you get groups of people that are willing to look at the world differently and envision different futures for the world, I think that you get into some really powerful discussions out there in the world where you're not doing it through any types of motive. It's just through an intellectual pursuit of curiosity and knowledge. And you find the right people that help to guide down that journey. So anytime that people can evaluate their life and find the areas where they're not thinking differently anymore, and they've just started to accept things, if you can reevaluate that and change your mindset again, you think differently and you'll get different outcomes. So that's the thing I hope people take away when they watch what I do, is just the approach to trying to take that independent thought process and run with that.
That's beautiful. I love that a lot. Think differently and make you think. It's also, we are already kind of at the end of the podcast, but I just want to get that in. Bitcoin was for me the moment where I started rethinking things that I thought to be true before, because all of a sudden one major thing broke in my mind of like central banks, and I had this mindset of like, inflation is good. We need inflation to power up the economy. I had that in my mind, and once that broke, I was like, "Oh, what else?" And it kind of triggers you down to really rethink things. And different people have different trigger events for that. But I see that a lot of people come into that because of Bitcoin. That's pretty beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, you need a big idea like Bitcoin to force you into that mind space, right? Until you see something that goes against the status quo for everybody else, and you start to evaluate it and you come to your own conclusion on it, you've got to break out of the cycle, right? It becomes much easier in your life to accept what everybody else tells you is fact than it is to spend the time to really think about it and analyze it and come up with a conclusion for yourself. But Bitcoin emerging onto the scene and seeing the growth trajectory that it took and starting to see the different use cases and how it changes storing your value. I mean, that's been very impactful, I think, to a lot of people. And that was kind of the springboard to go, well, what else have I accepted as normal? That's crazy, right? That I really shouldn't accept as normal. And now people get to think about that more, which I think is a beautiful gift.
Amazing. Our end routine of the podcast is where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest asked you the question, which person in Bitcoin or outside of Bitcoin had the biggest impact on the Bitcoin adoption so far?
Oh, man. It's interesting because it's taken so many turns for me. So, you get all the normal people like Safe Dean and the books that he wrote that really changed the way that you were willing to think. And then you get to people like Seyr, who completely changed your mind on how to utilize the capital markets as it pertains to Bitcoin. But, I think I'm going to have to say Safe Dean was really the first one that changed my mind in a big way, right? I think that his books have been really impactful in helping people to think different and to think of different outcomes for the world. But this space has been so unique in that it's filled with so many brilliant minds. I mean, the video that Lynn Alden put out not too long ago about the evolution of money, I mean, that blew my mind and totally changed the way that you think about money in the past and how it pertains to today. I mean, it was just brilliant. So you have so many brilliant people in this space that it is really hard to pick one. But if I had to pick, the one that really changed my mind first, I'm going to have to say that it was safety, and that got me first.
Absolutely. It was also him for me. I still have to get him on the podcast. I just realized that I never asked him.
He'd be a really great guest.
I have to get him on. Thank you so much, Ben, for being on the show, for being such an amazing guest. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can really find me one place. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm just on X. Most of the stuff that I put out is going to be on X, and it's just at Ben Werkman, and Werkman is Werkman. And that's where you'll see most of my content come out. So I really appreciate you having me on the podcast, Robin. I've loved your content for a very long time. So it was really fun to do this. I know I got sick last time, so I'm really happy that we finally made it happen. It might have taken us a while, but we got here.
Absolutely. It happens, definitely. Thank you so much for taking time, Ben. Also, thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.